Dennis-kenji. He is the scientific managing director at the Institute for Information Health and Medical Law at the University of Bremen in Germany. Thanks so much for being with us, Dennis. It's interesting because India does call itself the world's biggest democracy. Free speech is supposed to be a pillar of that. But if leaders can argue that these protesters pose a threat to security, how do you navigate that?
Well, the example of India and Twitter manifests a difficult relationship between social media and state regulation. On the one hand, there is a constitutional right to freedom of expression, but on the other hand, the state also has an interest in legally regulating unlawful expression. However, this is not a specifically Indian problem, but as we know, also a problem in the United States or even here in Germany, where laws are also created to regulate opinions. And whenever any interests have to be weighed up, compromises have to be made, and it is not possible even for the Indian government to find a solution that does equal justice to all interests. So freedom of expression, democracy, and the regulation of platforms are therefore not necessarily mutually exclusive, in my opinion.
Okay. Where do you think this all leaves Twitter, though, which now feels very responsible for its employees under different jurisdictions? I mean, let's look specifically now at the case of India.
Yeah, for globally active corporations like Twitter, it is extremely difficult to react appropriately to such a situation. The problem here lies in a lack of knowledge of the legal system and also in the fact that the Indian government holds not only the corporation itself responsible, but also its executives. So it is difficult to predict consequences here. However, the development has also shown a certain helplessness on the part of the Indian government, because since it is extremely difficult to regulate Twitter itself, the way out is being sought by the company's employees who are located in India, in fact. And this could also result in the group not to cease its business activities in India, but reducing the activity of the Indian headquarters to an absolute minimum.
Right. You talked about Twitter reacting appropriately. I mean, this is an unenviable position they're in because it's still not legally clear when a social media platform can be held legally responsible for spreading dangerous messages that could lead, to any such thing as death, rioting, while at the same time supposed to be protecting freedom of speech, and they're liable for that and being accused of censorship. How do they do it? Can you give us maybe an example of a democracy where they are getting it right?
I think that this is a very difficult question because it depends on the national legislation. So I do not see a democracy where this can be done completely right. And as I mentioned before, we have many different interests here which have to be weighed up against each other. So it would be very difficult to find a single and the best solution on how to regulate the freedom of expression. And of course, freedom of expression is also a term which has an open definition. So it will be always difficult for us to have a concrete regulation here which fits into all interests.
Right. There are other alternatives to Twitter now because of the company's executive decisions to have to block certain users, including Donald Trump in the U.S. So now there's Parler, and India has a version called Coup. Do you think they'll be able to do what Twitter kind of now can't?
Yeah, technical alternatives for these platforms are always available very quickly because the technical implementation effort is limited. Ultimately, however, we've again faced the same problems as with Twitter itself, because, for example, Parler or Coup in India are not decentralized platforms either. So that means they are subject to the same laws and the same state access options for the Indian government. And for Parler, for example, in the US in particular, it has become apparent that a considerable amount of illegal communication has also taken place via this platform, which is why the app was also shut down. And the path to alternative platforms of communication is therefore not, in my opinion, not necessarily the best solutions that we have.
I want to ask you personally then, if you think, I said these are Twitter's executive decisions that they've made, however controversial they might be in some cases. Do you think, in general, the company has made the right calls?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, I guess. So in the long term, it may be very difficult to predict because in the USA too, the platform had a hard time blocking certain expressions of opinion or even calls for public violence last year. And of course, in January this year, during the storm to the United States Capitol. Last but not least, this is also about Twitter's economic interests that are also often being forgotten. And in this respect too, the company is in a dilemma because since on the one hand, the company is supposed to represent freedom of expression to the outside world, but on the other hand, it remains still a business group with the intention of making profit. So it is very difficult to predict if the company has made the right calls in this concrete case. We will see in the future, I guess.
Okay. Dennis-kenji, thank you so much for joining us there from Bremen, Germany.